Howdy, welcome to the family tree presentation of Sierra, Kirby, and Kyle. Today we'll share discoveries with you and hopefully you find them as interesting as we did.
My family tree starts with my great-great-great-great-grandmother, Sarah Scott. She was born in South Carolina around 1840 and was considered a slave. Her parents and siblings were sold when she was a child, so she barely knew who they were. The man who bought her wanted Sarah to bear his children. After a number of beatings, she did. Her children were Victoria, Hannah, Mary, Jim, and Marcus, my great-great-great-grandfather. In 1880, she is shown to be married to Benjamin Scott. Marcus Scott married Carolina Wright, and they had 9 children. In 1895, Marcus moved his family to Burke County, where they remained until 1907. Marcus and Carolina's children grew up in Loudoun, Georgia, in an area known as the Broad Level. He and his family lived near Sarah sometime in the 1880s. My great-great-grandfather, Joseph Scott, was born around 1898 in South Carolina and married Frances Slater. They had one child, my great-grandfather, Norman Scott, who married Helen Scott and had 11 children. Both sides of my family lived in the same area, a place called Homestown, where my mother was growing up. Most of my family still live there, including my great-grandparents.
My name is Kirby Johnson, and my family originates in Spain, Mexico, and Ireland. The furthest I traced my family is to my great-great-great-great-grandpa, Dominica Stone, an Irishman who changed his name to Donis Pina. He boarded a Spanish ship and traveled to the port of Matamoros, Mexico, and lived in Baghdad, Mexico, where he met his wife, Cecilia Perez, a woman from Spain. The Martinez side of my family originates in Piedras Negras, Mexico. My great-grandma Maria was a part of a wealthy family and was considered a blue blood, while my great-grandpa Chico was just a cowboy from a neighboring ranch. Since my grandma was a higher social class than my grandpa, her family disinherited her and she decided to move. My great-grandparents moved back and forth between Texas until they settled permanently in Markham, Texas, where most of my family still lives. The Johnson side of my family is from Progreso, Yucatan, Mexico, on my grandpa Johnson's side, and Chicago for my grandpa's. I do not know much about my ancestors from Progreso, Yucatan, because my grandma died in 2007. Also, my grandpa Johnson wasn't able to give me much information about his family because he didn't have a relationship with his father, and my grandpa couldn't remember much about his grandparents.
Hello, my name is Kyle Hennigan. Both sides of my family have intensive documentation regarding family history. Using some names and dates they gave me, I was able to almost completely fill out my family tree up to my great-great-great-grandparents. I was able to trace my roots back to Ireland, Sweden, and Denmark. My grandmother was able to give me names, birth dates, and death dates of almost everybody on my mother's side of the family. There's only one problem which I was able to solve using Ancestry. My grandmother told me that Melinda G. Crutchfield was an orphan and she didn't know her parents, but through Ancestry I was able to find that her father, John Crutchfield, served in the Confederate Army and died just months before she was born. Her mother, Joanne Liddy, tried to raise her on her own as I found she filed for Confederate pensions. However, she passed away when Melinda was just 1. On Melinda's death certificate, her grandparents are listed as her parents. Until now, my family had been under the assumption that Melinda was orphaned and raised by people who had adopted her. We did not know that her parents were both deceased by the time she was 1, and her grandparents had to take care of her.
Most families in the South earn their living in the agricultural sector of the workforce, and our ancestors are not an exception. Since my ancestors come from Mexico and moved to Texas, most of them made their living by farming and working as cowboys on ranches. My grandpa, Manuel Pina, was the last farmer. He picked cotton as a young man until he started working in the oil business.
A majority of my family were farmers or laborers. Some owned their own farms, like my great-great-grandfather Henry Wade, and others rented, such as my family in South Carolina.
Farming was the primary source of income on both sides of my family until my grandparents. I found out that the Irish immigrants in my family came to America around the time of the potato famine. Many of my other ancestors moved to America as farmers and continued farming when they arrived.
After meeting, Cal and I both found out we have ancestors that are blind. My grandpa Johnson was a popular blind DJ in Mexico City. He recently published 2 books. Mexico by Touch, which gives a detailed account on how he became a DJ. I learned that he drove a car, met Stevie Wonder, and had an appendicitis just like me. He wrote another book, In His Own Little World, that documents his time as a blind child.
My great-grandfather Albert Kane passed away when I was 5. Because he wasn't deaf and blind until he was older, he is able to still remember how to do many of the things he used to be able to do before he became deaf and blind.
Sierra and Kyle both have ancestors that fought in major wars.
My great-great-uncle Marcus Scott II served in World War II. In 1888, my great-great-great-grandfather John Singleton was enlisted into the Army.
I was only able to find one of my ancestors to fight in a war. John Crutchfield fought for the Confederate Army during the Civil War.